Look, I know this sounds like some elaborate scheme, but honestly, sometimes timing is everything. And 3 years of planning finally paid off in the most spectacular way possible. So here's the backstory. I'm 28, work in tech, and back in 2022, I was dating this girl, Catherine, for about 2 years. We lived together, I helped pay for her apartment, bought groceries, basically supported her while she was finding herself through various failed art projects and part-time gigs. Her dad, David, always liked me. We'd bond over classic cars whenever I visited their family home. The man had been dreaming about owning a 1967 Mustang Fastback since he was 16, and I remember him showing me photos and talking about how it was his ultimate goal once he retired. Here's where it gets messy. In September 2022, I came home early from a work trip and found Catherine in our bed with some guy named Kane. Not just sleeping together, but they had clearly been using our apartment for weeks while I traveled. My stuff moved around, different food in the fridge, the works. When I confronted them, Catherine didn't even apologize. She told me I was boring, that Kane understood her artistic vision, and that she'd been planning to leave me anyway. Then she said something that has been burned into my brain for 3 years. She laughed and said her dad always thought I was trying too hard to impress him with my car knowledge and that I'd never be able to afford anything David actually wanted anyway. Kane, this scrawny wannabe photographer, just smirked and told me I should probably find somewhere else to stay tonight since they had plans, in my own apartment, that I paid for. I moved out that week, but here's the thing, I didn't get angry. I got strategic. See, Catherine always treated her parents like her personal ATM. Whenever she needed rent money, car repairs, or funding for her latest creative project, she'd call Daddy. David and his wife, Norma, basically enabled this behavior for years, but I could tell David was getting frustrated with her attitude. He'd make comments about how Catherine didn't appreciate what she had, how she expected everything handed to her, so I started planning. I kept working, got promoted, saved aggressively. Most importantly, I stayed friendly with David. Not in a weird way. I'd run into him at the hardware store sometimes. We'd chat about cars and life. He never brought up Catherine, and neither did I. But I could tell he was disappointed in how things ended. He'd make comments about how I was a good guy, how he hoped I was doing well. Fast forward to last month. David's 65th birthday was coming up, and I found out through some mutual friends that Catherine was planning this big party for him. She'd been bragging on social media about how she was organizing everything, how she was finally going to show her parents how much she appreciated them. The party was going to be at their house on a Saturday afternoon with about 50 family members and friends. Here's where my 3 years of saving and planning came together. I'd been tracking classic car auctions and private sales, and I found the perfect 1967 Mustang Fastback in pristine condition about 2 hours away. Original engine, immaculate interior, everything David had described in his dream car. The owner wanted $32,000, which was almost exactly what I'd saved up over 3 years. I bought the car 2 weeks before David's party. Then I did something Catherine would never expect. I called David directly and asked if I could stop by the party to wish him happy birthday. I told him I had something special I wanted to give him, and that I hoped it would be okay despite the awkward situation with Catherine. David was genuinely happy to hear from me, and said of course I was welcome. The day of the party, I drove the Mustang to David's house and parked it across the street. Catherine was already drunk when I arrived, hanging all over Kane and acting like she was hosting some exclusive event. When she saw me walk up to the backyard, her whole demeanor changed. She got this look like she couldn't believe I had the nerve to show up. I waited until David was opening gifts, then I walked over with the title and keys. The look on David's face when I told him the car across the street was his birthday present? Man, it was worth every penny and every hour I'd worked to afford it. He actually started tearing up, kept saying he couldn't believe it, asking me over and over if I was serious. That's when Catherine lost it completely. She grabbed the microphone they'd set up for speeches and started screaming about how I was her desperate ex who was still obsessed with her. She jumped onto the hood of the Mustang and started yelling about how I was pathetic and trying to buy her father's love. Then she took her keys and scratched "loser" into the hood while screaming about how it was a $20,000 mistake and how Kane was taking her to Cabo. The entire party went silent. David's face went red, and he grabbed Catherine's wrist, telling her he was ashamed to call her his daughter and that she needed to get out of his house immediately. Catherine started screaming at me, saying I'd turned her father against her and calling me manipulative. I just smiled and told her she'd regret this sooner than she thought. Then I drove off. That was 4 days ago. Since then, Catherine has called me 16 times and sent 61 texts. The last message I got this morning said her parents changed the locks, her dad cut off her credit cards, and she can't make rent. She's apparently sleeping in her car and begging me to answer. I'm not responding. 3 years ago, she humiliated me in my own home and told me I'd never amount to anything her family would respect. Last Saturday, she destroyed a genuine gift I'd worked years to afford and insulted me in front of 50 people. Sometimes people need to learn that actions have consequences. And sometimes timing really is everything. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys. I thought Catherine's text messages were desperate, but this morning she actually showed up at my apartment. And let me tell you, the conversation that followed was absolutely wild. First, thanks for all the support on my last post. Some of you called this whole situation petty, but honestly, after what happened today, I'm more convinced than ever that Catherine needed to face some real consequences for how she treats people. So here's what went down. I was getting ready for work around 7 this morning when someone started pounding on my door, not knocking. Full-on aggressive banging like the building was on fire. I looked through the peephole, and there's Catherine, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Hair a mess, wearing the same clothes from her Instagram post 2 days ago. I opened the door and she immediately started talking fast, like she'd rehearsed this whole speech. She told me she was sorry for what happened at the party, that she was drunk and emotional, and that she never meant to scratch the car. She said she knew I was a good person and that her reaction was just because seeing me brought up old feelings about our relationship ending. But then, and this is where it gets interesting, she started trying to explain why she acted the way she did at the party. Catherine told me she'd been under tremendous pressure from Kane to prove she was over me, and that he'd been telling her for months that I was probably still trying to win her back. When I showed up with this expensive gift for her dad, Kane freaked out and said it proved I was still obsessed with her. So she felt like she had to make a scene to show Kane that she was completely done with me. I asked her why Kane's opinion mattered so much that she'd humiliate herself and destroy property in front of her entire family. Catherine got defensive and said I wouldn't understand because Kane is an artist, and he sees things differently than regular people. She said Kane helped her realize that I always tried to control situations by being overly generous, and that giving her dad the car was just another manipulation tactic. This is where I started getting angry, because she was literally standing at my door asking for help while simultaneously insulting me and defending the guy she cheated with. I told her that Kane's artistic vision apparently didn't include helping her pay rent when Daddy cut her off. Catherine's whole demeanor changed when I said that. She started crying and told me her parents weren't just angry about the car incident. They were furious about things they'd discovered afterward. Apparently, after the party, David and Norma started really looking at Catherine's life and realized she'd been lying to them for months. She'd told them she was working part-time at an art gallery, but they found out she'd been fired 6 months ago and never mentioned it. She'd also been using the credit card they gave her for emergencies to pay for Kane's photography equipment and trips. But here's the really interesting part. Catherine told me that Kane dumped her the day after the party, not because he felt bad about what happened, but because he found out her parents cut her off financially. Apparently, Kane had been planning on Catherine funding their trip to Cabo with her dad's credit card, and when that fell through, he decided she wasn't worth the hassle anymore. She found out he'd been talking to another girl on Instagram for weeks. So now Catherine is completely alone. No boyfriend, no family support, no job, and facing eviction from her apartment next week. She begged me to talk to her parents, to explain that she was sorry and that she'd learned her lesson. She said David always listened to me and that if I vouched for her, maybe they'd give her another chance. I looked at her standing there, this person who'd spent years taking everything for granted and treating people like garbage. And I realized this was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Not just her asking for help, but her finally understanding that actions have consequences. I told Catherine I'd think about it, but that she needed to understand something first. For 3 years, I'd watched her treat her parents like a personal bank while showing them no respect. I'd seen her cheat on me, and then mock me for caring about things her family valued. And at the party, she'd shown everyone exactly who she really was. Someone who'd destroy other people's property when she didn't get her way. Catherine started getting frustrated and said I was being vindictive, that I was enjoying watching her suffer. She said the old me would never have been so cold, and that I'd changed into someone she didn't recognize. I told her she was right. I had changed. 3 years ago, I would have felt sorry for her and tried to fix her problems. But now, I understood that some people need to hit rock bottom before they learn to appreciate what they have. She asked me point blank if I was going to help her or not. I said I'd give her my answer tomorrow, but that she needed to really think about whether she was sorry for her actions or just sorry about the consequences. After she left, I sat there thinking about how perfectly this was all playing out. Catherine had always believed that her looks and her daddy's money meant she could treat people however she wanted. Now she's learning what happens when both of those safety nets disappear. The thing is, I already know what I'm going to tell her tomorrow, and honestly, I think some of you are going to be surprised by my decision. Part of me wants to help her parents understand that she's genuinely struggling, because David and Norma are good people who love their daughter despite everything. But the other part of me remembers exactly how Catherine laughed when she told me I'd never be good enough for her family. Tomorrow's conversation is going to be very interesting. Update 2. You guys, I need to get this all out because what happened today was absolutely insane. Remember how I said Catherine's conversation with me was going to be interesting? Well, it turns out I was completely wrong about how this was going to play out. So, yesterday evening, after Catherine left my apartment, I spent hours thinking about what I was going to tell her. Part of me wanted to watch her squirm a little longer, but honestly, seeing her that desperate was starting to feel weird. I decided I'd tell her I wasn't going to interfere with her parents' decision, but that she needed to take responsibility for fixing things herself. Then, around 9 last night, my phone rang. It was David. He asked if I could come over this morning because he and Norma wanted to talk to me about something important. He sounded serious, not angry, just like he had something heavy on his mind. I showed up at their house around 10 this morning, and the conversation that followed was absolutely not what I expected. David and Norma were sitting at their kitchen table with folders and papers spread out everywhere. They invited me to sit down, and David started by thanking me again for the car and apologizing for Catherine's behavior at the party. But then Norma started talking, and this is where everything got complicated. She told me that after the party, they'd spent several days really looking at Catherine's life and trying to understand how their daughter had become someone who would destroy other people's property in public. What they found out was way worse than I'd realized. Norma explained that Catherine hadn't just been lying about having a job. She'd been forging documents to make it look like she was employed. She'd created fake pay stubs and tax forms to show her parents when they asked about her income. The credit card they'd given her for emergencies had been maxed out on things like expensive dinners, designer clothes, and equipment for Kane's photography business. David showed me bank statements proving that Catherine had been withdrawing cash advances and then lying about what the money was for. When they confronted her about it 2 days ago, she broke down and admitted she'd been living completely off their support for almost a year while pretending to be independent. But here's the part that really got to me. Norma told me they'd found out Catherine had been bad-mouthing me to their extended family for 3 years. She'd been telling relatives that I was controlling and jealous, that I'd tried to isolate her from her friends, and that I'd been financially abusive during our relationship. Some of their family members had actually been avoiding me at social events because they believed Catherine's version of our breakup. David said he felt terrible about this because he'd always known I was a good person, but he'd stayed out of it because he didn't want to take sides between his daughter and her ex-boyfriend. Finding out that Catherine had been lying about me while I was still being kind to their family made him realize how manipulative she'd become. Then they asked me something I wasn't prepared for. David wanted to know if I thought they were being too harsh by cutting Catherine off completely. He said seeing her show up at my apartment begging for help had made Norma feel guilty, and they were wondering if they should give her one more chance to prove she could change. This is where I had to make a choice about what kind of person I wanted to be. I could have told them to keep Catherine cut off, that she deserved to face the full consequences of her actions. Part of me wanted to see her struggle longer, to really understand what it felt like to have no safety net. But sitting there looking at two parents who genuinely loved their daughter, despite everything she'd done, I realized that my revenge had already worked perfectly. Catherine had humiliated herself in front of everyone who mattered to her. She'd lost Kane, lost her family's support, and learned that her entitled attitude had real consequences. Most importantly, her parents now saw exactly who she really was. I told David and Norma that I thought Catherine needed to face some consequences for her actions, but that completely cutting her off might just make her more desperate and vindictive. I suggested they consider helping her, but with strict conditions and oversight. No more credit cards, no more cash handouts, and any support should come with requirements that she get a real job and start paying them back. David nodded and said that's what they'd been thinking too. Then he asked me if I'd be willing to be part of a family meeting where they laid out these new terms to Catherine. He said Catherine might be more likely to accept the conditions if I was there as a witness, since she'd already admitted to me that she understood she'd messed up. I agreed, partly because I was curious to see how Catherine would react, and partly because I wanted to make sure she understood that her parents' new boundaries weren't going away. The meeting is happening tomorrow afternoon at David and Norma's house. Catherine doesn't know I'm going to be there. They're just telling her to come over to discuss her situation. I have a feeling this conversation is going to be very interesting, especially when Catherine realizes that her parents now know about all the lies she's been telling about me. I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I realize that the best revenge isn't destroying someone's life. It's letting them destroy it themselves while you watch from a position of strength. Catherine spent 3 years believing she could treat people however she wanted without consequences. Now she's learning that actions matter, and that entitled behavior eventually catches up with you. Tomorrow's meeting should be the final piece of this whole puzzle. Catherine is going to have to sit in a room with her parents and me and acknowledge everything she's done while accepting that her old life of getting everything handed to her is over. I'll update you all after the meeting. Something tells me Catherine is going to have some very interesting things to say when she realizes the extent of what her parents have discovered. Final update. Reddit. I'm still processing what happened today, but I promised you all a final update, and this story definitely has an ending. The family meeting with Catherine, her parents, and me was absolutely everything I'd hoped for after 3 years of planning, and honestly so much more than I ever expected. I got to David and Norma's house about 30 minutes before Catherine was supposed to arrive. David had set up the living room with chairs arranged so everyone could see each other clearly, and Norma had prepared all the documentation they'd gathered about Catherine's lies. The fake pay stubs, credit card statements, bank records, everything was organized in neat folders on the coffee table. When I saw the extent of what they'd discovered, I realized Catherine's deception went way deeper than even I had imagined. David told me they'd decided not to warn Catherine that I was going to be there because they wanted her honest reaction to seeing me. They also wanted to see if she'd try to lie about our conversation at my apartment the other day. Norma showed me some of the forged documents Catherine had created, and I was shocked at how elaborate the whole scheme was. She hadn't just lied about having a job, she'd created an entire fake life complete with payroll stubs, tax documents, and even fake references. David explained that they'd spent the last week calling around to verify Catherine's claims about her employment and discovered she'd been using a friend's address and phone number to create fake references. When they called the art gallery where she claimed to work, they found out she'd been fired 8 months ago for showing up late and leaving early consistently. The manager told them Catherine had blamed her attendance issues on me, claiming I was controlling and wouldn't let her work normal hours. When Catherine walked in and saw me sitting there, her face went completely white. She stood frozen in the doorway for several seconds, looking back and forth between me and her parents, like she was trying to calculate what had gone wrong. Finally, she asked why I was there, and you could hear the panic in her voice. David told her to sit down because they had serious things to discuss about her future. Catherine sat down across from me, and I could see her hands shaking as she tried to figure out what was happening. She kept glancing at the folders on the coffee table, probably recognizing some of her own handiwork. Norma started the conversation by laying out all the evidence they'd discovered about Catherine's lies. The fake employment documents, the credit card abuse, the cash advances she'd taken while claiming to be financially independent. Catherine immediately went into defense mode, but her explanations were getting more desperate and less believable by the minute. She started explaining that she'd only lied about the job because she didn't want to disappoint them, and that she'd been planning to pay back the credit card money once she found steady work. She said the fake documents were just temporary while she figured out her career path, that she never meant for things to go this far. But then David asked her about the things she'd been telling their extended family about me, and Catherine's entire demeanor changed when she realized her parents knew about that too. She tried to backtrack and said she'd only told people I was controlling because she was hurt about our breakup and wanted their support. David pulled out his phone and showed her screenshots of text messages she'd sent to various family members, detailing elaborate stories about how I'd supposedly monitored her spending and isolated her from friends. This is where I finally spoke up because, frankly, I was getting tired of listening to her make excuses. I told Catherine that for 3 years, I'd known exactly what kind of person she was, and that everything that happened at the party just proved it to everyone else. I said I'd spent 3 years working hard and saving money specifically so I could afford a gesture that would show her parents how much I valued their relationship, even after she'd humiliated me in my own home. Catherine got angry and said I was being manipulative, that giving her dad the car was just a way to make her look bad. She said I'd planned the whole thing to turn her family against her, and that I was vindictive and obsessed with getting revenge. She accused me of holding a grudge for 3 years and orchestrating this whole situation just to watch her suffer. I looked at her and said she was absolutely right. I had planned it, and it was revenge. But the beautiful thing was that all I'd done was give her father a thoughtful gift and be respectful to her family. Everything else that happened was entirely her choice. I didn't make her jump on the car, scratch it, or scream insults at a family gathering. I didn't make her lie to her parents for months or abuse their trust. I didn't make her cheat on me with Kane or mock me to my face while doing it. Catherine started getting more agitated and said I was twisting everything around, that I was making myself look like the victim when I deliberately set up this whole scenario. She said any normal person would have moved on after 3 years, but that I was clearly obsessed and unhealthy. David interrupted and told Catherine that this wasn't about me being manipulative. It was about her showing her true character when she felt threatened. He said that my gesture had been genuine and generous, and her response to it revealed everything they needed to know about who she'd become. Norma then opened one of the folders and started reading from a list of Catherine's lies that they'd compiled. Things like claiming she was taking art classes when she was actually spending the money on Kane's equipment, telling them she was networking at gallery events when she was really at parties, using their emergency credit card to pay for a weekend trip to the beach that she'd claimed was a work conference. The list went on for several minutes, and I watched Catherine's face get redder with each revelation. Catherine started crying and begged them to give her another chance. She said she understood she'd made mistakes and that she was ready to change. She promised she'd get a real job and pay them back everything she owed. She said the lies had started small and just spiraled out of control, that she never meant to hurt anyone. But then she made the mistake of saying that a lot of her problems started because she was so heartbroken after our relationship ended, and that Kane had helped her realize she deserved better than someone who didn't appreciate her artistic nature. David's face went red when she said that, and he told her to stop trying to blame other people for her choices. He said that even if she was heartbroken, that didn't give her the right to forge documents and steal money from her family. Norma pointed out that Catherine had been lying about her job and finances long before Kane was even in the picture, so she couldn't use our breakup as an excuse for everything. That's when Catherine really lost it and started screaming at me that this was all my fault, that I'd turned her parents against her and ruined her life just because I couldn't accept that she'd moved on. She said I was pathetic and obsessed, and that showing up with the car proved I'd never gotten over her. She accused me of manipulating her parents by pretending to be the perfect son-in-law they'd always wanted. I stayed calm and told Catherine that she'd made her own choices every step of the way. I said that if she thought I was so pathetic and obsessed, she probably shouldn't have shown up at my apartment begging for help. I pointed out that Kane had dumped her the second her parents cut off her money, which proved that he'd never actually cared about her artistic vision. He'd just been using her for financial support. Norma pulled out a written contract they'd prepared, and the conversation got very serious very quickly. It outlined exactly how Catherine could earn back their support. She had to find full-time employment within 2 weeks, attend weekly family meetings to discuss her progress, and pay back the credit card debt at a rate of $200 per month. No more lies, no more excuses, and absolutely no contact with Kane or anyone from that social circle. She also had to give them access to her bank statements and employment records to verify she was being honest. But here's the part that made this whole 3-year plan worth it. David told Catherine that part of earning back their trust meant she had to apologize to me for the lies she'd spread about our relationship and for destroying my gift at the party. Not just a quick sorry, but a real acknowledgement of how her behavior had affected other people. He said they'd learned about the stories she'd been telling family members and that she needed to take responsibility for damaging my reputation with people who mattered to them. Catherine looked at me with this expression of complete defeat and said she was sorry for scratching the car and for the things she'd said at the party. But when David pressed her to apologize for the lies she'd told their family about me, she hesitated. She said she'd been hurt and emotional, and that she'd just been trying to explain why our relationship ended. She claimed she hadn't meant to make me look bad, just to help people understand her perspective. I told Catherine that I didn't need her apology for my own peace of mind. I'd moved on from caring about her opinion 3 years ago. But her parents deserved to know that she could take responsibility for her actions without making excuses. I said that if she wanted to rebuild their trust, she needed to admit that she deliberately lied about me to protect her own image. After several minutes of uncomfortable silence, Catherine finally admitted that she'd exaggerated and lied about our relationship because she wanted people to think the breakup was my fault instead of hers. She said she'd been embarrassed that I'd caught her cheating and that she'd made up stories to protect her reputation. But even then, she tried to minimize it by saying she'd only told a few people and hadn't thought it would spread through the family. David pulled out his phone again and showed her the text messages, proving that she'd actively contacted multiple family members with detailed stories about my supposed controlling behavior. Some of the messages were from just a few months ago, long after our relationship had ended. Norma said they'd heard from cousins, aunts, and family friends who had all received similar stories from Catherine over the years. David and Norma exchanged a look, and I could see they were both disappointed, but not surprised. Norma told Catherine that she could live in their guest room for 1 month while she found a job and an affordable apartment, but that this was absolutely her last chance to prove she could be trustworthy. If she violated any part of the contract or lied about anything, even something small, they would cut her off permanently. Catherine signed the contract, and I could see that she finally understood the full scope of what her behavior had cost her. She'd lost her boyfriend, her independence, her parents' unconditional support, and her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. But most importantly, she'd lost the respect of everyone who mattered to her. And now, she had to earn it all back through actual effort and honesty. As I was getting ready to leave, Catherine stopped me. and asked if I felt better now that I'd gotten my revenge. I told her that the revenge wasn't making her suffer. It was proving to myself and everyone else that I didn't need to accept being treated poorly just to maintain relationships with people who didn't respect me. I said that 3 years ago she'd made me feel like I wasn't good enough, but now I knew that her opinion had never mattered in the first place. 3 years ago, Catherine told me I'd never be good enough for her family and that I'd never amount to anything they'd value. Last Saturday, her own father chose to keep a gift from me while kicking her out of his house. Today, her parents asked me to be part of the conversation about her future because they trust my judgment more than hers. The contrast couldn't be more perfect. The best revenge isn't destroying someone's life. It's building your own life so well that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant. Catherine spent 3 years thinking she'd won by cheating on me and mocking me. But while she was lying to her parents and living off their money, I was working hard and becoming the kind of person who could afford to be genuinely generous without expecting anything in return. As I drove home today, I realized that this whole situation had given me exactly what I'd wanted. Not just Catherine facing consequences, but proof that I'd become someone worth respecting. The car gift wasn't really about revenge anymore. It was about showing myself that I'd grown into someone who could turn a humiliating betrayal into a demonstration of character. Catherine will probably never understand that the reason her parents trust me more than her isn't because I manipulated them. It's because I chose to respond to being hurt by becoming a better person instead of a more bitter one. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Catherine showed me exactly who she was 3 years ago, and everything that happened since then just confirmed it. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to let someone else's worst behavior turn you into a worse version of yourself. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, people will destroy their own lives without any help from you. David texted me tonight saying the Mustang is getting detailed tomorrow and that he can't wait to take it for a proper drive. He also said Catherine spent the evening in her room, making phone calls, presumably trying to find a job before her 2-week deadline. It's funny how quickly someone can develop a work ethic when their safety net disappears.